His name was Elias, a man who had measured his life in seasons and silence. For 40 years, his cabin had stood as a lone sentinel against the edge of a vast, unnamed wilderness. The woods were his neighbor, his warden, and his only constant companion since his wife had passed. His world was small, contained by the reach of his axe and the length of his trap lines. It was a life of deliberate routine. Each morning began with the scrape of a match and the scent of wood smoke. He chopped wood, mended fences, and walked the perimeter of his land. The sounds of his existence were simple: the crisp thud of steel splitting pine, the crunch of his boots on dry leaves, the low whistle of wind through the ancient trees that guarded his home. He had grown accustomed to the quiet. He had come to depend on it. But the quiet had changed. It started subtly, a shift in the forest's deep voice. For weeks, he had felt a new weight in the air, an unseen pressure. It began with the sounds. A deep, resonant call at dusk that was not the bugle of an elk nor the cry of a mountain lion. It was lower, more sorrowful, a sound that seemed to well up from the very bedrock of the mountains. He told himself it was the wind in a hollow log, a trick of acoustics. Then came the physical signs. He found branches snapped clean off thick pines, 20 feet from the ground. No storm could do that with such precision. No bear could reach that high. He found a single, massive footprint pressed deep into the mud by the creek bed. It was manlike, but impossibly large, the toes splayed wide. He stared at it until the rain began to fall, washing its edges away, turning it back into a simple, meaningless puddle. It was easier to believe it was a trick of the light. He felt watched. It was a primal sensation, a prickling on the back of his neck when he worked near the tree line. He would stop, his axe held halfway through its swing, and slowly scan the dense wall of green and shadow. He never saw anything. There was only the rustle of leaves, the chatter of a squirrel. Yet, the feeling remained. The woods he had known his entire life had become a strange and unfamiliar place. It held a secret now, one that whispered just beyond the edge of his perception. The legend was a part of this place, a story told in hushed tones around campfires by men long dead. A tale of giant, hair-covered men who lived in the deepest parts of the forest. The shadow folk, the silent ones. Elias had always considered them stories for children, campfire fables to explain the strange noises of the night. He was a practical man. He believed in what he could see and touch. He believed in deer, bear, and the unforgiving logic of nature. The storm came on a Tuesday. It was a violent, furious thing, a tempest that threw rain like fists against his windows and screamed through the trees. Thunder cracked like the world splitting open. For 2 days, he stayed inside, listening to the rage. When it finally passed, the silence it left behind was absolute, profound. The world outside his door was broken and remade. He went out to survey the damage. Ancient trees lay defeated, their roots torn from the earth like monuments toppled. The air smelled of snapped pine and wet soil. He followed his usual path along the northern edge of his property, his boots sinking into the sodden ground. It was then he heard it. It was not the familiar sound of a wounded animal. It was a low, guttural moan, a sound of such profound agony that it cut through the morning stillness and went straight to his bones. The sound came again, a desperate, shuddering groan. It was close. Curiosity, mixed with a deeper, more humane concern, pulled him off the path. He moved slowly, his senses on high alert. The sound led him deeper into the jumble of fallen timber, into a small clearing created by the storm's fury. He pushed aside a curtain of wet ferns. And he froze. It was not a bear. It was not a man. It was something else entirely. It was a legend made real, a nightmare given flesh and breath. The creature was immense, a towering figure covered in thick, matted fur the color of damp earth and old bark. It was slumped against the trunk of a fallen giant, a colossal oak that had crashed down in the storm. The tree had not missed. Its immense weight had crushed the creature's lower leg, pinning it helplessly to the ground. Elias stood motionless, hidden by the ferns. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drum in the sudden silence. Fear, cold and absolute, seized him. Every instinct screamed at him to turn, to run, to flee back to the safety of his cabin and bolt the door. This was a monster from the old tales. Its sheer size was terrifying. Its muscles, coiled and powerful even in repose, spoke of a strength that could tear him apart without a thought. But then the creature moved its head. It lifted it slowly, and its eyes met his. They were not the eyes of a beast. There was no mindless rage, no predatory gleam. They were deep and dark, and in them, he saw a shocking intelligence. He saw pain. He saw exhaustion. He saw a plea. It made another sound, a low rumble of despair that was not a threat, but a surrender. In that moment, the monster ceased to be a monster. It was simply a living thing, trapped and in agony. Elias saw the splintered end of a bone protruding through the dark fur of its leg. He saw the shallow, labored breaths that fogged the cool morning air. The fear in his chest did not vanish, but something else rose to meet it. It was a familiar ache, the old, deep-seated compassion that had defined the quiet man he was. He could not leave it like this. He simply could not. He took one slow step back, then another. The creature's eyes followed him, but it made no move. It watched him retreat, a silent, knowing observer. He did not run. He walked back the way he came, his mind racing. The conflict within him was a storm as violent as the one that had just passed. To help was madness. To walk away was impossible. Compassion won. He returned to his cabin, his hands trembling slightly. He filled a large bucket with fresh water from the pump. He took a heavy wool blanket, old and worn but clean, from a storage chest. He found a block of salt and a half-dozen apples. It was a meager offering, but it was all he could think of. He carried the items back into the woods, his heart still a wild thing in his chest. He stopped 20 feet from the clearing's edge. The creature had not moved. Its head was down now, resting on its massive chest. He set the bucket of water on the ground. He placed the apples and the salt lick beside it. He unfolded the blanket and laid it out carefully. He wanted to speak, to offer some kind of reassurance, but the words felt foolish, useless. What could he say to a legend? "I will not hurt you," he whispered, the words barely a breath. He did not know if it understood. He backed away slowly and returned to his cabin. He watched from his window until dusk fell, but he saw nothing. The forest kept its secrets. The next morning, he returned. The bucket was empty. The apples were gone. The salt lick was gone. The blanket had been pulled closer to the creature's body, draped over its uninjured shoulder. It was watching him again, a silent vigil. There was a new stillness to its gaze, a deep and cautious curiosity. Elias went back and returned with a large portion of smoked venison, wrapped in cloth. He set it in the same spot as before. He refilled the water bucket. He did this for 3 days. It became a new routine, a silent, strange communion between two solitary beings. He would bring supplies, and the creature would accept them. Neither moved closer. A fragile truce was being built across the space of that small clearing. On the 4th day, as he approached, he felt it again. The feeling of being watched. But this time, it was different. It was not a single presence. It was multiplied. He stopped and scanned the ridge that overlooked the clearing. There, standing half-hidden behind an ancient cedar, was another one. It was larger than the one that was trapped, its shoulders broader, its presence more commanding. It stood perfectly still, a silent, powerful sentinel. Elias felt a fresh wave of fear. This was not a lone creature. This was a family, a clan. He was being tested. The sentinel on the ridge was judging him, weighing his intentions. His every instinct told him to drop the food and back away, to show submission. But a deeper part of him, a part that understood respect more than fear, held him fast. He did not retreat. He looked from the trapped creature to the one on the ridge. He held his ground. He took a slow breath and continued his approach to the usual spot. He set down the water and the food. He did not look up at the ridge again. He simply completed his task as he had done before, a quiet act of trust. Then he turned and walked away, his back exposed. It was the most vulnerable he had ever felt. When he reached the edge of the woods, he risked a glance back. The sentinel was gone. It had melted back into the forest as if it were never there. The trapped creature was looking at him. Slowly, with immense effort, it lifted its massive arm. It extended its hand toward him, palm open. It was not a gesture of aggression. It was a communication. He did not know what it meant, but he understood the intent. He had passed the test. Trust had been offered. The leg was not getting better. The wound was festering, and the creature was weakening. Elias could see it in the growing dullness of its eyes. He knew that without intervention, it would die here, pinned by the dead tree. He spent a sleepless night staring at the ceiling of his cabin. The image of those intelligent, pained eyes burned into his mind. There was only one thing he could do. It was a terrible risk, but he had to take it. The next morning, he dragged his heaviest equipment from the old barn. A gas-powered winch, thick logging chains, and a sturdy steel cable. It was noisy, heavy, and dangerous. He hauled it all through the woods on a small sled, the metal clanking and scraping. The sounds felt like a violation of the quiet pact he had made. When he reached the clearing, the creature watched him with wary eyes. The sentinel was back on the ridge, and this time, it was not alone. A third, smaller creature stood beside it, likely a female. They stood like statues, observing his every move. He ignored them. He had a job to do. He worked all day. He secured the chains around the massive trunk of the fallen oak. He anchored the winch to the base of another, larger tree. The work was slow and exhausting. He had to get the angles just right. A mistake could be fatal. It could shift the weight and crush the creature further, or snap the cable and kill him. Throughout it all, the trapped one watched him, its low rumbles a constant, unreadable commentary. It did not struggle. It seemed to understand. It seemed to trust him. As dusk began to settle, he was finally ready. He took a deep breath. He looked at the creature on the ground, then at the two figures on the ridge. He pulled the starter cord on the winch. The engine roared to life, a deafening, mechanical scream that shattered the forest's peace. The creatures on the ridge flinched but held their ground. The cable went taut. The chains groaned under the immense strain. The winch motor whined, fighting against tons of dead weight. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, with a sound of tortured wood, the massive oak began to lift. It moved an inch, then another. Elias kept the tension steady, his hands slick with sweat. He raised it just enough, creating a small gap between the trunk and the ground below. With a deep, guttural cry of pain and effort, the creature tore its mangled leg free. It dragged itself backward, away from the tree, and collapsed onto the forest floor, panting heavily. Elias immediately killed the engine. The silence that rushed back and was dizzying. It was done. He stood there, breathing hard, his body trembling with adrenaline and exertion. The creature lay on the ground, its chest heaving. It slowly pushed itself up onto its elbows. It looked at the space where its leg had been trapped. Then it looked at him. The depth of that gaze was something he would never forget. It held more emotion than he had ever seen in any human eyes. Slowly, deliberately, it extended its huge, uninjured arm toward him. It uncurled its fingers, revealing a broad, calloused palm. It was a gesture of profound, silent communication. It was not a request. It was not a threat. It was an acknowledgement. It was gratitude. Elias felt a wave of awe wash over him, so powerful it brought tears to his eyes. He gave a slow, single nod. The gesture was understood. The two figures on the ridge descended. They moved with a silent, fluid grace that belied their immense size. They went to their injured companion. The female made soft, clicking sounds, a strange and gentle language of comfort. They helped the wounded one to its feet. It leaned on them, its broken leg held off the ground. A family, he thought. They were a family. They began to move away, a slow, pained procession back toward the deep wilderness. But before they disappeared into the shadows, the one he had saved stopped. It turned its head and looked back at him one last time. The gaze held no fear, no anger. It was a look of shared experience, of a debt understood between two worlds. A silent farewell, and then they were gone. They dissolved into the trees, leaving no sound, no trail, only the imprint of their existence on his soul. Elias stood alone in the gathering dark. The clearing felt vast and empty. The air was heavy with the absence of them. He was left with the winch, the chains, and the deep gouge in the earth where a life had been pinned and then saved. The world felt different now. It was larger, stranger, and more full of wonder than he had ever imagined. He packed up his equipment and hauled it back to the barn. He cleaned his tools and put them away. He went inside his cabin and sat in his old chair, watching the fire. He did not sleep that night. He replayed every moment in his mind. The fear, the pain in its eyes, the silent sentinel on the ridge, the final, meaningful glance. He never told anyone. He knew they would not believe him. They would call him a liar or a madman. They would want proof. They would organize hunts. They would turn a moment of grace and trust into a spectacle. This secret was not theirs to know. It was his. A shocking, beautiful gift given to him in the deep woods. He lived out the rest of his years in that cabin. The forest was never the same again. It was no longer just a collection of trees and animals. It was a sanctuary, a borderland. He never saw them again, not clearly. But sometimes, on a quiet evening, he would feel it. The sense of being watched. It no longer felt menacing. It felt like a vigil. It felt like protection. And he knew, in the deep and silent part of his heart, that he was not alone.